Chapter 2 Fangs and Fittings. The sun had just risen, shining in from a small round colonial window. Its rays streaked across Mac's eyes, raising him awake. He rolled the thin cover off of himself and got dressed. His attire consisted of loose trousers and a loose shirt. Mac exited his room, closing the door behind him. The cap flap cut into the bottom swayed softly. To Mac's right, he saw the small staircase leading to the tiny loft above him. Across from him he saw the door to Bartholomew and Claire's room. He turned left to walk down the hallway. It was a short journey, as the doors were positioned near the end of the hallway anyway. He leaned against the railing of a long part of the stairs as he woke up, a habit of his. Rubbing his eyes, he looked up and saw the innards of the barn-style roof above him, and then looked at the wall that sectioned off the attic loft. The wall was bare besides some glass-like catches Claire was fond of, which would be glistening with light provided by a window in the eaves, provided the sun shone through it at this time of day. Mac ruffled his hair and walked downstairs, then heard a voice he recognized but hadn't heard in a long while. The man's voice was gravelly, almost as if he was speaking over top of a constant growl. Mac, having remembered who the voice belonged to, calmly increased his pace. As Mac rounded the staircase, he saw him, Fang, the man that brought him here to Rosecross. Fang had his chair turned slightly, his straight legs crossed at the ankle. He had his elbow on the table, looking at both Bartholomew and Claire, chatting like the old friends they were. Cicero Fang Beale was wearing his adventuring gear, as he always was. As a guard and a hunter, he always was ready to fight. His attire consisted of dark brown to the point of being black pants, with shin, knee and thigh armor riveted to it along with some supportive straps. And the well-worn metal of his thigh armor was an attached pouch containing small equipment like pistol crossbow bolts. The pants were topped with a wide belt that had various implements and pouches on it that also held up his leg armor by the supporting straps. The grey three-quarter sleeve shirt was low-cut enough to reveal his clavicle and crescent moon necklace set with a purple gemstone. His zippered brown-black leather jacket was hanging on the back of his chair. It had thicker segmented armor around the shoulders, and various metal plates and pockets decorated its surface. His naginata, named Howler, a half-sword, half-spear, was leaning up against the table. Its long curved blade that was 2/5 the length of the weapon was pointed down in its sheath with its hooked crossguard, ring pommel, and long purple-wrapped ashen handle that was usually kept on his back. Fang's thinner face, hardened by battles and strife, always had a light glow about it, as if he still held unto the purity of life. His black goatee was longer near the mouth and chin, while shorter along the jawline and cleanly shaved underneath his jaw and neck. Scars adorned his face, but have mostly faded due to time. A notable scar went across his left eye, starting at the temple and ending on the side of his nostril. The eye was undamaged, but it caused a segment of his eyebrow to never grow back, resulting in a thumb's-width gap in his pointed eyebrow. Something Bartholomew had said caused Fang's piercing golden eyes to light up and his lips parted to laugh, showing his brilliant white teeth with pronounced fangs. "Ah, there he is. Oh, he has grown into a strapping man, hasn't he?" Fang exclaimed, setting down his cup of tea to move his arms upward as a jovial, welcoming gesture. "You have been feeding the boy well, my dear older sister," Fang said to Claire, a compliment that was coated with the spice of sibling teasing. He has a peculiar habit of mentioning his sister's femininity when he spoke with her. Mac grabbed himself some tea and oatmeal from the cook pots and positioned himself in an open chair next to Bartholomew and across from Fang. "Well, indeed, the boy works hard and eats plenty, sick. You need to eat more yourself, you're so skinny," Aunt Claire said proudly, but with rolled eyes, as she stood up to place her own dirty flatware into the sink. "You know the reason I look as gaunt as I do, sis," Fang said knowingly, smoothing his beard down slowly. He had a ring as gold as his eyes and his index finger. "I'm still not fond of Mac being taken on a hunt. He's just a child," Claire said in a pointed tone to her brother. She had come behind Mac, resting her hands on his shoulders, most likely a subconscious action of protection. "He is not the same boy I saved from that burning village 13 years ago. I can sense he has grown and changed," Fang insisted, leaning forward, prodding the table with emphasis before crossing his arms. Yeah, that was your first mission at Mac's age, and if I remember correctly, Cicero, you almost died from that encounter. Claire rebuked, leaning over Mac to glare at her younger brother. I became stronger in the end because of it. Fang replied, casually sipping his tea. Mac kept himself busy with his food instead of interjecting. He didn't want to change the ultimate decision of what was happening to him. He knew this was Aunt Claire just holding onto her little boy. Fang is right, dear. He has experience and is an amazing warrior. He's a squad leader after all and was able to survive the lycanthropy treatment 10 years ago. You know, the one that has a 9 out of 10 chance of killing the patient, Bartholomew said, reaching over to rub his wife's shoulders to comfort her. Oh, thanks, Bartholomew. You really sell me well, chuckled Fang as he ran his hand over his head to rub his hair. His salt and pepper hair was held back by a purple leather headband that swept up at the temples, across the forehead, and to a subtle point. Even with Fang being only 37, the stress of combat and his destitute years as a werewolf has caused premature graying, as well as a thinner frame than expected. The wild mane of hair that was contained inside of the headband spilled out over a hole in the crown. Fang's hair was like steel wool, so he didn't need much head protection. It was naturally straight and abrasive no matter what was done to it. Mac had finished his food and emptied his drink. Having run out of things to excuse him from not talking, he said confidently, Aunt Claire, I am ready to learn to fight and provide for the village. A shocked Claire placed her hand subconsciously on her chest as she eyed Mac. It was as if she saw him finally as a full-grown man and not the crying little orphan boy she had fostered all these years. There, that settles it, Fang said matter-of-factly. I already had him booked with some of my suppliers, anyway, for fittings for gear, clothes, and weapons. He was corralling the conversation in his favor. You mean the Fosters, right? Brooke will probably freak out at how much Mac has grown since last year, Claire said. Cebu began walking down the stairs, stretching as he went before setting his eyes on Fang and hissing before hiding behind Mac's legs. What's that mangy mutt doing here? Cebu demanded. His fur was on end and his eyes never left Fang's form. Mac leaned down and petted Cebu. Cebu, they just said he had the procedure. He can't transform into a werewolf. Actually, Mac, that's not true. The lycanthropy procedure does not remove my ability to transform. It allows me to control my transformation freely. I'm not forced to transform during a full moon anymore and can do it when I like while retaining my sanity and mind. I'm now a type 3 werewolf. Fang leaned in to explain. Mac's raised eyebrows were answered by Bartholomew, who held up his hand to quell the confusion brimming. There are 3 classifications of lycanthropy sufferers or types. Type 1 wild, uncontrolled, and tempted, turned into the beast form unwillingly upon a full moon when you are first infected with the disease unless treated. These people usually become wild beggars living in the dregs of society. With the medication being expensive, this is fairly common and adds to why the area in between towns is so dangerous. Type 2 well-maintained supply of medication that while still transformed unwillingly during the full moon, the medicine removes the pain and grants a docile demeanor during the transformation. Type 3 those that completed the procedure as Fang described himself. Bartholomew explained, I'm a type 3 werewolf, you see. I was a type 1 but now a type 3. Fang added, and that is supposed to be comforting, said Cebu, holding his reserves. He didn't like dogs, and the last time Cebu and Fang had interacted, Fang had tried to eat him. I'd rather be a type 3 werewolf than a type 2 wereshot. The water costs through the roof. But don't worry, Cebu, I won't eat you unless you deserve it, Fang said snidely. Claire Ebenrear, Nebil, and Bartholomew Ebenrear, I will follow Mac wherever he goes. Nothing will harm this boy under my eyes, stated Cebu nobly, standing proudly on the table, his paws together and his head held high. His bold announcement was to those who shared their suspicions of Fang, of which none did. Thank you, Cebu, that does make me feel better. Claire smiled and began scratching Cebu behind the ears, turning the feline into a purring kitten. He then began rolling around on his back, playing with a stray thread and her sleeve, distracting him once he noticed it. Anyway, if you are going on a hunt, I want you to take this necklace. It will give you peace of home. Claire turned and fetched a box from the cupboard behind her, and then handed Mac a box. And me peace of mind, she added, taking a seat on the table near her husband to see the whole picture of her purchase. A medium-sized oak box was pushed over to Mac. As he opened the cantilevered lid, he saw inside a dark grey metal torque. The metal expanded near the lower neckline to form a very thin bulging crescent. At the apex of the curve was a small crystal the size of a fat piece of chalk, set partially into it. Banks and Claire for the jewellery, Mac said with a questioning pause, looking between the other participants in the conversation for some context. Wow, you really did splurge on that, didn't you, hun? Bartholomew grimaced at the thought of the invoice, arms crossed, rolling his eyes. You're the preferred baker of the minister, darling. We are not hurting for money, and I only wanted my baby to be safe. Now let me help put it on, Claire said, standing up and hurrying around the table to help Mac fasten the necklace behind him. Look at how confused the poor boy is. Let me explain, exclaimed Fang, throwing his hands up in the air before continuing. That talk is designed to allow the user to create a shelter for themselves anywhere. Yeah, Bartholomew was right. It was a magnificent mattress one. Let's go outside and test it, slapping the table as he stood. They all stood up and went outside, pushing their chairs in as they went, exiting the door into the garden. The sun had by this point properly crested over the walls of the canyon and gave natural light across the town. The nearby lake glistened with light. They all blinked to adjust to the light and then turned to Mac. Claire was scanning through the directions she had plucked from the box. To open your room, pull the crystal from the torque and draw a square and a horizontal surface, such as the ground or table. The trapper will form from that square. No, it doesn't work on vertical surfaces. After using the room, touch the crystal to the door and it will disappear, able to be placed somewhere else. Claire read from the instructions, not looking up from reading aloud to see if there were any other things that should be noted. Come on, kid, open up the door. I want to see what's inside, Cebu said, snaking around Mac's legs, eyes eagerly looking up. All right. Mac reached up to his neckline and fumbled a bit to find the crystal. His fingers wrapped around it and gave it a light tug. It pulled from the socket it sat in. Then the crystal started to glow a deep radiant blue. Won't I lose the crystal if it comes out that easily? Mac asked the group, concerned about what he thought was a design flaw. Your hands are the only hands to be able to remove that now, Fan explained, voice tight from stretching his back with his hands behind his head, careful to not hit the handle of his weapon as he did so. Then release the air held in from the stretch, he said, and if you let go of the crystal it will immediately return to its place on your neck. Okay, that makes more sense. Mac crouched down and drew a square on the ground with the glowing crystal. A line of similar color light trailed behind the crystal where Mac was drawing until Mac completed the square. Mac pulled his hand back in reaction to the square filling up with deep blue light, dropping the crystal subconsciously, which did fly back to its socket in the torque which was dangling off Mac's chest from his crouch position. The blue light subsided, and in its place was a dark wooden frame the same size as the square Mac had drawn. Set into the wooden frame was a rough trapdoor with a large steel handle that also operated as a knocker. Not to interrupt this moment, but I have to go to work, Uncle Bartholomew said. He walked over to Mac, who was still crouched down, and patted him on the shoulder while also crouching down, whispered, looking directly into Mac's eyes, I'm proud of you, son. Thanks, Pops, Mac replied, returning the shoulder pat and the first vocal indication that Mac considered him a father figure. Bartholomew then said his goodbyes after standing up and disappeared into the house to grab something for work, presumably. Cebu walked next to the door through Mac's legs and glared at him, clearly impatient. Come on, brother, open it, snapped Cebu. Mac then opened the trapdoor and Cebu dived right in, having to suddenly catch air with his wings and slowed his descent to the floor 12 feet below him. Mac slid himself into the hole over a short ladder that connected to the entrance. His feet landed on a platform at the top of the room just low enough to give him headroom. He then got onto the ladder set into the wall next to the platform with ample ladder above for safety, descending the rest of the way 6 foot 3 inches to the floor. The room was illuminated by cold candles in holders designed to focus the light in a particular direction in each of the top corners of the room. The room was longer than it was wide. Along the short wall opposite the ladder Mac climbed down was a nice fireplace and mantel designed for cooking and warmth. Blank spaces sat in the corners on either side of the fireplace with ample walking room to get to them. The ladder he descended was against the wall which contained a door. To the right of the door after dismounting was a table and chair to be used for eating or as a desk. There was a large thin drawer set underneath it. The headboard of the bed was touching the table, creating an alcove of sorts. The bed had grey blankets on it and had a set of 6 drawers underneath it. These were set into 3 columns of 2. Opposite the bed was a long bookshelf containing only Zebu, who was watching Mac look over the room. Mac then turned around and opened the door, peeking his head into what he now understood was a bathroom. To his left, covering the entire width of the room, was a large stone bathtub with drying racks above, presumably for clothes after washing them in the tub. And to his right was a toilet in the corner and a sink with a mirror cabinet in the corner closest to the door. Mac closed the door and climbed up the ladder, holding the hatch open for Zebu to fly out. "You need to put a bed on that shelf for me. That's my shelf now. Also, a cap flap needs to be cut into the bathroom door so I can relieve myself in the night," remarked Zebu, who, even though he was a sentient cat with wings, he was still at his very core a cat. "I'll put it on the list," Mac said with a chuckle. He scanned around. Only Fang and Aunt Claire were waiting for him. He presumed Bartholomew was at work. This suspicion was correct as he saw the dark black smoke in the middle distance of Bartholomew starting his oven. Within the hour it would be near transparent smoke. "Well, what do you think?" asked Claire Hans, and her hips beaming with pride. "It's perfect. I love it, Aunt Claire. Thank you so much," Max said, walking over to give Claire a big hug. "I just want you to be safe out there, and most importantly, come home safe. You are all I have got, hun," Claire whispered through tears as she returned the hug. "Oh, please, save the waterworks. He's not departing for a week," Zebu said, rolling his eyes. Claire gave Zebu a light-hearted tap with her foot as she held back her tears. "All right, best be off. We do have an appointment to attend to," Fang said as he was holding onto the sheath for Mac's sword and shield. "Best tap that door with a crystal, and I bid thee farewell, my dear sister," Fang said, bowing and flourishing a hat he didn't have. Mac followed his instruction, removing the crystal from his neck and tapping the door, which disappeared in a puff of deep blue dust. Once released from his grasp, the crystal flew back into its socket effortlessly. Mac followed Fang through the town while fastening his sheaths and holsters to his waist while walking. Once he finished this, he allowed Zebu to climb onto his shoulders once more. "Off to the GAYEH shop then," Fang said merrily. Fang was an athletic man, yet walked with a purposeful saunter. His frame was scrappy. He spent a couple of years as a werewolf, wandering the streets, begging for food. Being malnourished for an extended amount of time leaves a lasting impression on the body. As he walked, he kept his hands hooked on his leg arm as support straps. Shoulders hunched slightly, his eyes watching all around him as an instinct. Mac rolled his eyes at the obvious pun the shop owners had come up with and continued walking through the paths in a southward direction to reach the shop. They walked past the Clarence Cuts and, peering into the large front window, saw some early bird clients chatting pleasantly to each other, none of which reached Mac's ears. The proprietor of the shop, Giles, with his long luscious hair, was working on a woman who had too much jewelry for her own good. Clay decided to try to have Giles use his hair potions on me to get my hair under control last year. Nothing in his arsenal did anything. He had a nervous breakdown. He still bothers me occasionally to test his new product to see if he will be the potion brewer to create the best product, Fang added as an aside while they walked. He was glad Giles' patron was a fussy woman, so he had no time to notice Fang walk by. "See, I told you he was a monster, making a man cry," sniveled Zebu from Mac's shoulder, little kitten eyes widening as his theory had more merit. "If you don't quit your campaign against him, I'll send you back home," cautioned Mac out the side of his mouth. Zebu resigned quietly, but Mac could tell he still was suspicious of Fang. Getting to the edge of the river, they stepped onto the mini-dock, which contained a small ticket booth and 3 inlets for boats to dock in. Each had a number on its side. The boats sitting in this particular dock were numbered 04 and 11, and the 3rd inlet was empty, indicating there were many more boats than these. An occupancy of 2. Minimal luggage to port. Fang said confidently when he reached the small booth. Mac was surprised to see that it was his ex-childhood friend Jessen managing the boats. Mac and Jessen used to be great friends when they were younger, but a teenage dispute made them drift apart. The nature of the dispute was lost to time, but the awkwardness left the rift between them agape. "Sure thing, sir," Jessen said calmly as he had pulled the reclined back of his chair forward to keep him at attention. Jessen touched his fingers across a pane of glass set into the counter. The glass displayed information and acted as a control board. Mac understood how the magic ferry system worked due to a field trip to the main tower while he was in school. In essence, a main controller would draw the pathways for all boats and a magical map of the river, making sure no collisions occurred. Taking in the requests from the 4 ports that the boats traveled between. "That will be 1 Zuckli, sir," Jessen announced, having finally looked up from the glass. "All right, let me get the coinage," replied Fang as he dug into an inner pocket of his armored jacket and retrieved the rounded golden cross that was a Zuckli and placed it in Jessen's hand. After successfully paying, they entered the boat, which had 4 seats in it with room for luggage. The front corner of the boat was taken up by a platform with a large glass sphere set into it. A faint periwinkle glow emanated as they situate themselves in the seats in the boat. A line sprung from the ball and drew a line in the air down the water toward where they were heading. The boat began following that faint line as it went. Zebu curled himself up onto the seat next to Mac to both take a pause from balancing on Mac's shoulders and to keep him safe from falling into the water. They passed the boat that was labeled number 1 heading back the way Mac, Fang and Zebu came. Mac noticed that it contained Orvar, the eldest son of Patsy and Gerald Morrissey, returning from shopping for his elderly mother, a task he did frequently. Orvar's dinghy piloted itself to the 3rd previously unoccupied inlet. He then disembarked laden with the shopping his mother sent him for, but not before adjusting his comically large glasses, having unfortunately inherited his mother's horrendous eyesight. "It's so nice to take the scenic route. I usually don't take the dinghies, because I'm with Oxheim, a member of my troop, and you will see why when you meet him," Fang said with a chuckle, sitting up from his reclined position to speak with his hands. The dampe tickled his nose as he spoke. Mac looked puzzled at why someone would be unable to use a small boat for transport, then busied himself with a purring Zebu next to him rubbing his fur. They looked across the river banks and saw houses spaced amply along the western bank. Fang noted a 3-story tall square building surrounded by other houses, which sat 2 properties back from the river. "That's where another member of my troop lives, at the lodging house. His name is Soko," Fang explained. The lodging house was a building that contained many smaller rooms that were designed for compact living. Some of the abodes were a single room with a bed, a hot plate, and a single lantern, with a small bathroom enclosed for privacy. Another style of abode the lodging house offered was 2 bedrooms and a common room, used by families that can't afford a property. The opposite eastern bank is devoid except for the opulent church. The church was less occupied than yesterday, with any inhabitants being devout practitioners, those visiting the graves of loved ones in the crypts below the church, or those in times of peril seeking religious comfort. Must Day 2 was usually the quietest day for religious practices, with the day of worship directly preceding it. They floated down the river and entered the circle basin at the center of the town, which contained the central tower as well as the 3 bridges connecting the man-made island at its center. The bridges were high enough for their boat to pass through. They circled the basin in a clockwise direction. Mac kept his eyes out of the left side of the craft and surveyed the scenery, ignoring the static central tower they orbited. He saw another dinghy port, this one bigger than the one they departed from, again situated at the corner of a bridge and next to the church with a set of stairs leading into the back of the church, an easy way for people to enter the building, and the left bank due east of the central tower situated between two bridges was a small park with beautifully kept hedges and little structures for children to play on since it was located near the schoolhouse. Passing under another bridge, Max saw the schoolhouse, where they drummed basic principles of life into you such as reading, math, and the basics of how the world looks. It's been 4 years since he last entered that building. He saw some children about age 10 outside. He guessed their age by the spell they were practicing. They were throwing little glowing balls of their energy to each other. Max struggled in school not because he was stupid, but only because he started education late due to his unique circumstances of growing up in an outskirts village. He did not start school at the proper age of 5, instead starting at age 7 unconsolable for a year after he was adopted by the Ebenrears. As they exited the basin, he saw in the distance Rosecross University, a building where those who had finished the mandatory primary school could pursue higher forms of knowledge instead of entering the workforce or pursuing a trade. The school has become prestigious in the past couple of years, with Rosecross being a melting point of cultures due to being a nice travel stop through the mountains, along with the traveler's knowledge granting a vast library of many sources to the college. Some teenagers were along the bank near the college, most of them exhausted laying on rocks. Teenagers haven't quite learned to temper their magic as well as their changing emotions, often draining themselves of energy dangerously. I wonder if that kitten hawk Cicero still teaches there, Mac asked, staring up at the large building on the hill. Yeah, he teaches. Extraordinary beasts and how to deal with them. His owner used to teach the class until he died, and since Cheche's went on all the adventures with his owner, he was able to teach the class. Fan explained, running his hands through the water as they traveled, creating a second, smaller disturbance in the water adjacent to the one the boat was making. 2 erranday, Sunday, Musday, Monday, Thursday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Wednesday, Day, Thursday, Rot Day, Friday, Zekiday, Saturday. They followed the river south before it curved eastward under one of the smaller bridges that crossed the river. This bridge has been reinforced due to the frequent use of ophiodons crossing the bridge to the butchers located on the left bank of the river. Ophiodons are a large slaughter animal who has been selectively bred to be eaten and milked. Produces many young and grows to the size of a rhinoceros. Its meat tastes like a mix between bacon, steak and chicken. They are basically a domesticated rhino used as a cow. Its horn acts like a tuba which it uses for mating calls. They are also harvested for their musical horns, not just their meat. Today was one such occasion. Mac heard the clops of their hooves and the breath being expelled from their nostrils, while the faint smell of farmland emanated from their coats. To their right, Mac stared up at the main tower of the dinghy ferries which controlled the magical boats up and down the river. A large hexagonal crystal glowed periwinkle from its roof. The dinghy repair yard lay adjacent to the tower, workers busying themselves with fixing damaged boats through both mundane and magical methods. They entered the widest portion of the river, which was dotted with magical boats either going between the ports for travel or hired to give the rider a relaxing half-hour out in the water. A large stone bridge crossed the widest portion of the river, its thick columns rising out of the crystalline water. As they passed underneath the bridge, Mac heard the dull drone of conversation from above it, which mixed with the sounds of songbirds coming from their nests that had been made in the mortar of the bridge. On the left banks at the market circle, a circular patch of roads with a dividing pathway. This is where anyone with a caravan can rent a patch of grass from the town to flock their wares. Admittedly, the ones that have rented the patches along the dividing pathway did better, as potential customers had to pass by them to navigate through town. So much so that these plots become coveted that some barren deals have been made to obtain them. On the right bank, down an opulent drive, sat the hospital, a place to fix anything from minor mundane ailments to the curing of major magical maladies. It was headed by Madame Sarah Lindgren, maiden name Rosecross, a descendant of the town founders who took the surname of the town in posterity. and the left bank situated next to the dinghy port they were heading to was the potion shop. They had a pipe that was dipped into the water, presumably to collect water for brewing. Their boat slid into its dock with a soft thud, and the gem on the front of the boat slowly dimmed to nothing. Fang and Mac disembarked on opposite sides. Zebu mounted Mac's shoulders once he stood up straight, regaining his land legs. They pushed themselves through the throng of people in the streets, the density caused by being near the gate to the town. Peering above the heads of travelers, merchants, and residents, Mac saw their destination. The large building was 2 stories and had a 1.5-story fence surrounding the backyard. The sounds of metal being hammered and then cooled emanated over the walls, as well as the sound of electricity arcing during a magical weld. The bottom floor consisted entirely of the shop, containing a large room for display and another for the actual craft. A garishly painted bold font sign sat out front. It was duplicated on 2 sides of its triangle posts to catch the attention of both newcomers of the town, being located so close to the entrance, and those from inside the canyon walls. The sign read GAYEH, get all your equipment here. The trio consisting of Fang, Mac, and Zebu entered the shop, their arrival announced by both the door chime and Fang. Hey Brooke, I'm sorry we're late. Fang bellowed into the shop, holding the door for Mac to get in, his shoulders hunched in preparation. A shrill, flamboyant voice answered Fang's apology with contempt. You know how busy I am, darling. You should be more punctual when you make an appointment with the amazing Brooke Foster. The person whose voice belonged to spinning around a corner, arms raised in a flamboyant way, akin to posing during a fiery tango. While Mac knew Brooke was a man, it was still hard to consolidate his brain with his eyes. Brooke's blonde hair was long, about mid-shoulder length when down, yet today he had it in a very messy bun with twin strands framing his femininely decorated face. He put his one perfectly manicured hand on his hips, where an open silk shirt and a partially flayed skirt met, while the other hand shook at Fang, chastising him and rattling the bangles Brooke had adorned his forearms with. Brooke closed the gap between them, walking lightly in his sparkled slippers. But you know I can never say no to that chiseled face of yours, home, Brooke said. He then turned his eyes, which were hidden behind the most garishly decorated glasses that ever existed, to Mac and covered his mouth. Oh, my, you sure have grown in the last year since we made your sword frog. This calls for an all-new redesign of your attire, he said, gnashing his teeth playfully while laughing and beckoning the group to follow him. Brooke led them flamboyantly into a room that had a dull cloth mannequin in the center, complete with legs, feet, arms, and hands, as well as a head. I hope you're wearing clean undies, because I want you to disrobe for measurements, cooed Brooke, smirking playfully while walking across the room to collect a large frog-mouthed bag. Fang found a chair in the room and Zebu perched himself out of arm's reach near him. Can we do this with my clothes on? Mac asked sheepishly. No. We must be accurate with our measurements, snapped Brooke a bit more aggressively than needed, almost as if he was offended. While bringing his bag over to a table closer, he explained a touch more calmly. I do apologize. I take pride in my craft, so I wish to do things right. Let the professionals worry about the small details, doll. Mac disrobed down to his underwear and stood in the room in full view of the room. Luckily, this room had no windows, or Mac would be more embarrassed than he already was. Brooke flapped his hands at 2 objects, causing them to provide their function. A large decorative pot with holes in it began emanating heat to keep the room warm while Mac was exposed. Mac felt thankful for the radiant heat as his goosebumps were beginning to form. The other object, a squat box with the curved bell of a horn, began playing up-tempo music. With the mood now set, let's let the magic happen. It would be best, darling, if you don't move, Brooke said, clapping his hands in excitement. He stood in between Mac and the mannequin, then extended his hands, fingers played, and suddenly wispy threads sprung from his fingers, filling the air. Zebu's eyes widened as he saw the strings form. His body shook, fighting against the feline urge to chase them. He had to put his face flat on the table to try to ignore the enticing allure of the seamstress's string. Some reached into the frog-mouth bag, pulling out measurement instruments such as ring sizers, calipers, calipers and tape measures. Other strings pulled and tugged at Mac until he was in the correct positions for measuring the anatomical position. The strings had no texture or temperature when they touched his skin. They just existed. The measuring devices flew around Mac, all being held up and operated by the strings. Measurements were taken all over his body. All 10 fingers were measured with a flurry of ring sizes. Ruled strips of ribbon wrapped around Mac's extremities and called multiple times while Brooke hummed in contemplation, occasionally matching the music. Calipers quickly and gently gripped his head in different places. Additional threads attached themselves to the mannequin, pulling and pushing on the cloth until after what felt like hours to match Mac's proportions exactly, while Brooke's fingers danced like a mad puppeteer. Soon the measuring instruments were placed back into the bag from which they came, and Brooke's fingers ceased their delirious dance. The strings that once filled the air faded from sight immediately after, putting Zebu at ease. "You may put your clothes back, and if you feel more comfortable," Brooke instructed Mac as he crouched down to turn a lock on the pole of the mannequin, locking the proportions in place. Mac hastily retrieved his clothes and donned them quickly before asking, "Okay, now what?" "Well, we consult with my husband and brother-in-law and all come up with a design together. With our expertise and your preferences, we will come up with something perfectly suited for you and your needs and propensities." "Well, isn't he just a cunning linguist?" Zebu remarked from his position, moving to the music. Brooke grabbed the mannequin on wheels and pushed it out of the room, beckoning everyone to follow him. Everyone did follow the humming Brooke into an adjacent room, one with design and drafting tables, lots of paper on bookshelves, also occupied with books. A large comfy conversation pit was built into the corner with a table and 3 chairs on its open side. Brooke gestured to the conversation pit, placing the mannequin near it. He walked to the window, slid it open, and coyly called out, "Oh boys, we have a consultation." The sounds of hammering slowly stopped as the workers found good places for their work to be set aside to enter the building. "What is it, darling? I can't hear while hammering," said a very deep-voiced man entering the room. "We have a consultation, Douglas." Brooke sneered at his husband, gesturing at the 3 chairs for him to sit down. Douglas was a large man with a very dark complexion, not rotund, just highly muscular. His muscles that were formed from years of precisely hammering steel or shaping stone were bulging his dark bell-up pants. These pants were double-laid for protection, covered in oils, slag, and had holes burnt through them. He pulled a silk hide jacket over his exposed torso, partially covering his chest-wide tattoo. Douglas towered over his wife, and the sound of his thick boots hitting the floor could not be masked by light walking. His head was shaved and bare, except for a pair of round goggles resting on his forehead and a rat tail that had a pink hot chom braided into it, no doubt by his wife. "You know, we do have to find ourselves an apprentice or hire some workers, lassie," said the second man, as tall as Douglas but not quite as built or dark. His body was covered by an apron with many pockets and loops stocked with tools. Below the waist, the men were dressed identically. "Artie, we want to keep this a family business," Douglas said softly to his brother, almost knowing the retort he would receive. "A family business that ends in 1 generation at this rate. If I continue to work so much, if I don't have time to find a partner to continue the bloodline, the story ends there," Artie said hurriedly to his brother. Artie approved of his brother's life choices 3, and even supported him greatly, but did value his family and bloodline. "Not discuss family matters in front of clients," Brooke said through clenched teeth, shooting daggers at Artie sharper than anything he could forge. Fine, Artie said, smoothing his braids behind his head as he sat on the chair looking at the clients. The group toiled away at designing the gear for Mac, stressing every detail. The Fosters occasionally shuffled between a bookshelf to bring back examples to Mac for him to understand their terminology. Fang gave his opinion on the advantages of certain armor styles, while Douglas professionally did the same. Cebu tried to slip into a perch for himself on Mac's shoulders, which the entire group rejected almost immediately. Mac discussed color palettes with Brooke as Otti tried to sway him into using a long-range weapon. Mac tried to say he didn't need one, but since Fangs strongly urged him to do so, they came up with the throwing darts as a compromise. They discussed chainmail sizes, particularly the gauge thickness of the links, weighing the pros and cons of thicker versus thinner gauges until they found a gauge that would not encumber Mac. "I guess that settles it," Brooke said, closing his sketchbook filled with the finalized design and details and sitting it on the table. "It will be ready later this evening. Now, if you gentlemen would allow us to get to work." He was ushering them out of the room with excitement in his eyes, eager to get to work. After some hasty farewells, Mac, Fang, and Cebu found themselves back in the populated streets of Rosecross, his sword frog feeling almost uncomfortably light without his sword and shield. "Those Fosters are really something, right?" Fan said, trying to get Mac excited for the world of adventure and connections he was displaying. "Define something." Cebu mused from Mac's shoulder. Mac felt his stomach growl, and he placed his hand on his gut. That breakfast felt so long ago in the beating midday sun. "Hungry?" Fang inquired, turning to look at Mac. "Oh, yes, please," replied Mac, who was massaging his stomach. "Fine, let's go to my favorite bar and you will meet some of my crew," Fang said, starting to lead the way. "He is going drinking and it's barely past noon." Cebu whispered in his companion's ear. "Hush, Cebu, it's fine, I'm sure they have some fish for you," Mac replied as he trotted off to keep up with Fang. They traveled northeast around the outskirts of the market stalls, dodging their wares. A couple of salesmen tried to pitch their supplies to them as they passed. They kept their heads high and noses forward, trying to ignore their calls. "Oh, aren't you happy we didn't go past the florist stall? You might make a fool of yourself, loverboy," teased Cebu. "Will you leave Belle out of this?" replied Mac. The thought crossed his mind to slap Cebu, but didn't want the marketers to notice him. Pulling Mac's attention from Belle Vaca and taking the eastern fork in the road, they climb up the staircase cut into the stone leading into the raised plateau section of the town. "Stairs are such a drag," Cebu whined from Mac's shoulders. "Says the one who can fly and always hitches a ride on someone's shoulders," remarked Fang, flashing his brilliant white fangs with a smile. "No one asked your opinion, doggy," Cebu said. After reaching the top of the stairs, they followed the road curving north, following it to a triangle part of the path that had a tall lantern built in the center. It wasn't lit, being midday, but the sun glistening off its glass giving it some sort of luminance. They took the western path, which was flanked on either side by one or two shabby houses. At the end of the road, which opened up to a circular depression in the road, was a large 3-story structure, with each layer getting smaller as it ascended, with the top floor being half the size of the one below it. A porch wrapped the entire way around the building on the ground floor. The porch had a slanted roof that connected just under windows on the second floor, and the roof for one half of the second floor is connected right at the top stud of the third floor. A vertical wall with windows completed one side of the right-angled triangle that was the third-floor roof. Chairs filled the porch and drunks filled the chairs, some if not most in strange positions of rest. Off to the left were two inebriated men sitting at a table, talking politely to solely each other, but having a completely different conversation than the other. "I don't mind them, the drunks are harmless this time of day. They do get rowdy when the sun goes down," Fang remarked with a dismissive hand, "and lead them into the bar."